In this video, I'm designing observation points. The project site is in Iceland, as you'll see from the photos. We're building observation towers near a fishing village. The program asks for 3 types of structures: a classic lookout hut, an observation tower, and 1 viewing spot at ground level. This area is known for bird watching, and maybe still is today. The nearby town used to hunt whales, which is honestly one of the things I hate most. Now it's more of a tourist spot, where people come to watch birds instead. You can get a sense of the site's scale here. It's a huge area. There's an old runway in the middle, not in use anymore, but maybe it could be one day. That long trace you see. It's not exactly solid ground. It's more of a lagoon, a place shaped by both land and water. Something I need to keep in mind while designing. When I first looked at the site, the word that came to mind was openness. It's rare to find such vast, endless landscapes in nature when designing. Not just because of the scale, but also because one side of the land meets the Atlantic Ocean. That sense of openness really defined my first impression. The second thing I started thinking about was access. How do people reach these observation spots? Where do they come from? How do they get there? And who are they? What happens along the way? I want to explore the project through these 2 ideas. I don't have a clear plan yet, but that's where I'll start thinking. For example, I want to draw a random route. At this scale, it's more about points and vectors. Let's assume the road leading to the old runway is the main path to the observation point. Just a guess, but I think it makes sense. Since there'll be multiple structures in different locations, we'll actually need a route connecting them. And as people move from one to another, what kind of story will that journey tell? How will these structures relate to each other? Will they share a connected narrative? Since there will be multiple types, each one is actually going to have a pretty long route. Right now, though, I'm a bit torn because movement can actually scare the birds. So somewhere along the way, you need spots of stability. That's why just moving people from one tower or structure to another isn't necessarily the best approach. Although, of course, there's a way to make it work, like adding some kind of programmatic limit. For example, you could say that people only move to observation towers at certain times of the day. You could create a kind of schedule so that observation happens in a controlled way. By schedule, I mean literally in terms of timing, not rigid rules. At the same time, I wanted to sketch this while thinking about all the obstacles on the site. It reminded me a little of zigzag patterns. There's openness, yes, but also constraints. For instance, when you reach this path, on one side there's water. You're walking, and on that side it's just the Atlantic Ocean stretching out. It's not exactly a cozy, friendly environment in some places, and that naturally creates these zigzags and turns in the route. On top of that, it forces you to interact with the terrain more directly, because it becomes personal. It's not just a path you follow, you're responding to the landscape. An obstacle shows up, and you have to navigate around it. You have to react to it. Then you turn, and suddenly you face something else. Later, as you continue in a different direction, the ground beneath your feet changes. It might get wet or soft. Maybe you even scare a bird or some small animal along the way. These little moments all come together to create a kind of story, almost like the site is narrating itself to you. But essentially, the scale we're looking at needs to be closer, more intimate. Even if the distances between elements are large, I can still make them feel connected if I design the road thoughtfully. If we keep going with the idea of openness, here's what comes to mind first. Let's say you're out there on the site, looking toward the runway. You're about to move forward, or maybe just wandering around. Your goal is to reach one of the observation towers, the hut, or the ground level platform. What would you want to see along the way? Or, what would I want to see? That's the question I keep coming back to. When I work, I usually have this reflex. I see something, some quality, and instantly think of its opposite. I try to build a connection between the two, to reveal one through the other. So openness also made me think of enclosure. What I mean is, imagine this vast, endless land by the Atlantic, and somewhere far away, you notice something enclosed, a trace, a small mark in the distance. Would it draw you in? Would it make you curious? I don't really know yet, but I want to explore what kind of relationship could form between those things. The program limits the height to 7 meters, just to note that first. I imagine the three structures like a small family placed relatively close to each other. Or maybe from a distance you just see a wall in the landscape. I wondered if that could work somehow. When you draw a wall, from a certain point you sense enclosure. There's a hut here, another there, and you experience that same feeling again. The huts appear as closed boxes until you get closer. Or maybe there's another way. Since movement scares the birds and animals, I thought, could there be something that hides people's motion as they walk? At some point your path develops a rhythm. No matter how much it zigzags, on average, it still runs straight. You're not wandering off hundreds of meters. You stay roughly in the same area. Then I thought, what if there's a large structure following that rhythm? Would that even make sense? I'm not sure about the scale. Maybe part of your route could pass through it. But as I sketched it out, it didn't feel quite right. Because it might block your experience of the site itself. If I were walking there, I wouldn't want one side to be covered by a wooden wall. I'd rather walk in the open. So it doesn't sound very logical. But maybe if it's subtle, it could still work. I started thinking like this. What if we approached openness and enclosure in a slightly different way? In a wide, open space, everything just spreads out. When you look toward the horizon, or really in any direction, you're surrounded by so much information, so many things happening at once. It's almost overwhelming. So I wondered, what if we tried to concentrate all of that into a single focused point? You walk through this expansive open area, taking it all in, and then at some moment you arrive at the hut. You enter through a kind of corridor, and the program suggests that each hut should hold about 10 people. So imagine this, you walk, and finally you reach this dense, concentrated space. Here your connection to the surroundings becomes more personal, but at the same time, more contained, more limited. Even if you came with others, you might end up moving single file. Maybe the only thing you see is what's right in front of you. Or maybe not even that. Maybe it's just a wall, and the only thing reaching you is light filtering in. I wanted to push that idea a bit further. I'm still not fully happy with the form yet, but as a way of thinking, it actually feels like it could work, maybe just expressed differently in another way. Let's look at it this way. To start shaping the form, I thought, what are the basic elements that really define a birdwatching hut? First, after that whole walk through the landscape, you're going to want to sit down. So a seating element, that's definitely one of the essentials. Second, you're going to want to look outside to connect with the surroundings. So there needs to be a window or some kind of opening that frames the view. And third, people will need a place to take care of basic needs. So basically, these three things, sitting, viewing, and utility, define the hut at its core. How they connect to one another, how they relate spatially, that's where the architecture comes in. One thing that came to mind was the needs part. That requires some sort of enclosure. And we've already been thinking about enclosure, right? So maybe here, both ideas, openness and enclosure, can exist together, complementing each other. What I mean is this: you arrive at the hut, you walk through a corridor again. Before I had just added a random wall at the end, which didn't really make sense. But now instead of a wall, imagine there's a small toilet. For 10 people, maybe 1 or 2 units is enough. And I realized I could actually turn that toilet volume itself into a kind of barrier, something that helps define the space while also serving a practical purpose. You enter, moving from light and openness into darkness, into a sense of enclosure. The space narrows, becomes denser, presses down on you, and the experience starts to feel very personal. Maybe you arrived with a group, maybe with your partner, but here I wanted to create a kind of artificial discomfort. What I mean is, the experience becomes as personal, as intimate, as focused as possible, even if just for a brief moment. And that intensity, that sense of individuality, doesn't necessarily come only from narrowing the space. Maybe it can come from adding something subtle to that narrowness, something that shapes how you perceive it. I started thinking, what should the walls be made of? because when you create such a constriction, your relationship to the walls changes. You might instinctively reach out, stretch your arms, and touch both sides at once. The material suddenly becomes part of the experience. My first instinct was wood, light, familiar, traditionally used in this region. Imagine the walls of this passage lined with wooden slats. Light seeps in between them, but not everywhere. You're in darkness, yet at the same time, you can feel the texture, the tangibility of the space around you. At first, I even thought, what if the walls carried the texture of the soil you've been walking on all along? I said wood eventually because it felt more conventional, more straightforward. But maybe the tunnel could actually be made from compacted earth. That would simplify construction if the soil allows it. And more importantly, it would bring your earlier experience, the landscape, the ground you've been walking on, directly into this intense personal moment, linking the journey outside to the feeling inside. Maybe the whole structure doesn't have to be made of compacted earth. It could simply be a surface you can touch, a kind of cladding. For example, there could be a frame made of slats. I'm not sure if it would be too heavy. I haven't gone into that much detail. Then maybe you attach thin panels to it, their texture resembling soil. Doesn't sound entirely convincing, but maybe there's another way. Since this is a kind of transition space, before entering the actual interior, imagine that the ground here is literally made of soil. That idea made me question the relationship a bit, because of course, people would be walking with shoes. But even in a wooden house, you notice the difference underfoot. It sounds different, it feels different. So I think having soil here wouldn't be unreasonable. It would also work as a kind of threshold, telling you where you are. And I think it should be dark. Nothing else around. If there's a light source, it should be the light at the end of the tunnel. At that point, the soil could end and the wood could begin. And maybe that's where the actual cabin starts. Of course, inside the cabin, there's still the question, how do sitting and viewing coexist? What kind of relationship do they form? I haven't really said much about that yet, because I wasn't thinking about it in that moment. But we do need to integrate it eventually. I feel like I've gone a bit too deep into the details. I'd like to step back a little. Sometimes it's necessary to zoom in and out at different scales. And right now, I'd like to zoom out. I'm going to follow up on another idea. We've got the 3 types of structures, right? If you look closely, there's a relationship in height between them. The heights kind of dictate what you experience. For example, the program says 10 people, each level 5, and this one 5 too. The lowest one lets you experience ground level. That's part of it. Since there are multiple structures, a rhythm forms across the site. Of course, you won't enter all of them. Let's say you move through them in sequence, observing from different spots and angles. That creates a continuous sort of rotation. The rhythm also comes from technical differences between structures or functional differences. These function differences affect how you relate to the space. So the progression, how you move through it, really matters. Did you start from the hut or from the ground level type? That choice changes the scenario a bit. So I want to think more about that. It seems like a good way to set up the story. First, the most conventional, getting to the hut. Of course, you could visit the other types as well, but for me, this felt like the natural starting point, the right sequence to follow. You begin at the hut. There's a seating area where you can rest for a moment, take a breath, and settle in. After that pause, you move on. Next comes the tower, and this one will challenge you a bit more. You'll climb up, feel the effort in your legs, notice your body moving in space. Then third, there's the ground level spot. This part is the most relaxed, the least intense. You can just take in the surroundings without any strain. So this kind of progression felt logical, moving from comfort to effort, then back to calm. When I started thinking about how this would reflect in the project as a whole, I realized it might not make a huge difference in a strict sense. Think of it more as a suggestion, a kind of recommended sequence, the order we found most suitable to shape the experience. I haven't set a fixed scenario yet, but it seems like a reasonable way to guide people through the space. Thinking about tiredness, effort, or intensity, it reminded me of something familiar. Comfort, the feeling of being at home. Maybe we can tap into that connection. Imagine it as a kind of temporary home, a small refuge in the landscape. And if we follow the sequence we discussed earlier, a stone wall, a narrow stone corridor, not earth this time, because stone is everywhere here, part of the environment. At the very end, there's a toilet. Simple, functional. This spot could almost feel like a tiny house built against the stone wall. Even if it's open on top, letting light in, it still carries that sense of shelter, of being enclosed just enough to feel protected, while still connected to the outdoors. Human movement can scare birds, so somehow we need to prevent that. I started thinking, maybe the envelope could be mirrored glass, blending the structure with the surroundings. At the same time, I keep wondering, when you reach the observation area, do you want to see a frame around what you're looking at? Do you want a visible frame, or would you rather feel completely immersed in the space? We need to answer that. Should the structure be fully open, or should it create a subtle frame that keeps you within it? If it were me, I'd want to feel fully inside the space as much as possible. At the same time, this could coexist with the idea of comfort. You experience the outdoors up to a point. It's cold, you're in Iceland, the wind might be harsh, and then you reach a warm, inviting spot. Maybe there's no fireplace, maybe there is. Who knows? But even then, it doesn't disconnect you from the surroundings. You're still fully present in the environment, not just seeing it like a framed picture on a wall. I looked into it. A traditional chimney fireplace, something that gives off real, tangible warmth, can actually scare birds because of the noise and the smoke. In these cases, a bioethanol fireplace is usually recommended, or maybe a low smoke sealed wood stove. Something along those lines could probably work. I think warmth is really important in a space like this. Otherwise, you probably can't stay long. Sure, you can, but why stay cold if comfort is an option? That's really where the whole comfort idea started to matter. Iceland's climate is harsh, unpredictable, and windy. At the same time, the corridor idea makes sense for creating intensity and guiding the experience, but it also feels a bit off in some ways. For example, if a wall blocks the view from one side, it makes sense for people to approach from that direction, at least to avoid scaring the birds. But maybe that isn't even a huge problem. If you make the wall stone and handle it with local materials without covering the top, you could sort of solve the corridor issue just by having a simple wall there. In a way, the two scenarios sort of merge. The tower faces one direction, the cabin another, and the wall I imagine next to the cabin blocks the view from birds on the ground for a fair distance. Of course, if the distance is too big, it doesn't really matter, but it could still make sense for anyone inside the cabin observing. You move along, and the people inside can keep watching. It doesn't always have to be done in groups. The experience can be very personal, individual, or shared. Still, I'm not totally set on the wall idea. I feel like I could change it, tweak it, maybe even merge it with another approach. It's flexible, and that's kind of the point. Letting the experience evolve as you think about it. This part actually works for me. Responding openness with closeness, intensity, you get that rhythm. But in terms of keeping birds from getting scared, it's not super functional. Maybe we could do something like keep one function, drop the other. There could still be a corridor, stone again, maybe. You walk past the stone wall, turn, and sit. Since this is for 10 people, it would be a long corridor. People sit side by side. Then you get a little reveal moment. You turn, and suddenly you're in an open space. Coming from the denser area, it's like stepping into openness. Now you might say, does everyone have to sit in the same spot? I might want to sit somewhere else with my partner. I might not want to sit with these other people. I thought about that too, but nothing concrete came up. Since it's a relatively small scale, I figured it probably won't be an issue. So in section, it looks something like this. I drew it super simple, and I kind of missed the scale a bit, but in terms of logic, this is more or less how it works. Now here's what I started thinking. Sure, the way people approach the space makes sense. But once they're actually inside, should they start forming some sort of relationship with each other? I'm honestly not sure. This spot feels like it sits somewhere between the other two concepts. Maybe it becomes a place where new people naturally meet. It could make sense for them to watch birds, share small conversations, and just exist in the same space without it feeling forced. I mean, of course, people can talk in all the spaces, but this one might lean a little bit more toward being around others comfortably. If we think about distributing the idea of privacy across the three types like this, the most private spot would be the one closer to the ground. The tower could be the one that's the most focused on the birds themselves. And the cabin would land somewhere in the middle, slightly more community-oriented, a bit more social. It's almost like you took pieces of a house and spread them across the site, and this one somehow turned into the dining room. There's a table in the middle, and people naturally gather and sit around it. Behind them, there's this solid stone wall, giving a bit of shelter and a grounded feeling. And maybe somewhere nearby, there's even a small fireplace or stove, just enough to bring a sense of warmth without making it feel like an interior room. People might not even face the same direction. Maybe the table is round, because if everyone sits in one straight line, they all end up looking at the exact same thing. But with a round table, the dynamics change. Imagine a plan like this. People sitting around that round table, each with a slightly different view. If someone notices something interesting outside, they can point it out, and suddenly everyone turns and looks together. That alone becomes a natural way for people to interact without forcing any kind of social moment. The layout could be something like a half circle or nearly circular table, people seated around it, and a small low-smoke wood stove placed roughly in the center. I don't think the chimney would block the view in any meaningful way. And if the windows are reflective, the fire and the people inside wouldn't be visible from outside, so it shouldn't disturb the birds either. It stays warm and inviting on the inside, while still remaining quiet and respectful to the landscape. It might have gotten a bit too big, scale-wise, So I do have that hesitation right now. But at the same time, having a round setup, everyone being able to look in different directions, I actually don't hate that idea at all. If the footprint were a bit larger, I don't think it would be a huge problem. Having a table, for photos, binoculars, people's stuff, makes sense in a practical way. But maybe for the social side of things, you don't even really need the table. Maybe the circular arrangement itself does most of the work. So maybe it becomes just a kind of circular hollow, a simple space where people sit around the edge. That might actually be more reasonable and maybe even more honest to the idea. I'm not fully sure about the exact details yet. People just sit, no table, just a shared place to pause and settle for a moment. I think what I'm trying to create here is a subtle sense of being a group, at least in this unit, in this typology, not forced together, but naturally aware of one another. I think birdwatching is an interesting activity, but it's not really a way of spending time that I can personally relate to. Things like going for a walk, I feel much more connected to those, but birdwatching doesn't immediately spark anything in my mind. But then I started thinking about this. There's an art movement called American land art. Artists create these large-scale works that are either spread across the landscape or carved into it, sometimes so far away that you have to make a journey to even reach them. And the point isn't just the artwork itself, it's the entire process of getting there. Your experience of moving toward it, the route you take observing the environment before you even arrive. American land art really emphasizes that whole journey. The first example that comes to mind is spiral jetty. So when I think about having different types of structures or different concepts forming a continuous story across the site, it doesn't feel strange at all. In a way, it becomes an extension of the path idea. You enter a road. You enter it. You arrive somewhere. You're inside the landscape, not just looking at it, but experiencing it step by step. Then the structure you finally step into, it becomes part of that story. Thinking about it almost like pieces of a house scattered along a journey, maybe that's where this idea leads, to imagining what kind of story these places could create together. For example, this came to mind. We didn't really think much about the tower, but what if the structure I sketched, something like that, were used for the tower? How would that work? What if it were something like an amphitheater? It would spread out a bit, but maybe it wouldn't be exactly like this, because it kind of ends up facing a single point. That could be an advantage too, of course. Depends on how you set up the system. In any case, there would be some sort of staircase leading up with intermediate platforms, and those could work as small observation stations along the way. At the same time, I have this instinct. I don't want it to completely disappear in the landscape. But the movement inside shouldn't be visible, so the birds don't get startled. So if you're using glass, for example, it needs to be reflective. But in a concept like this, does it end up being glass everywhere? No, I think it turns into something more like a structure with lots of windows. It doesn't need to hold many people, but maybe it becomes something with multiple openings, like the image I keep getting is this, probably because of the nearby village. Something wooden, something reminiscent of houses comes to mind. Of course, it doesn't have to be like that. I want to shift a bit from spaces to concepts, to more abstract ideas. Thinking this way feels more useful. When I think of a tower, I imagine a nail driven into the ground. It has a piece like this. And we had two types of structures, right? Maybe the tower and the semi-underground one could actually work together. One part rises up, and another part sinks down. If it steps up gradually like that, the footprint gets bigger. And on this kind of site, making something with a huge footprint doesn't feel right. Let's go back to the very beginning and think about the path again. At its core, you're simply on a path and moving forward. So what kind of relationship do you enter as you walk? What kind of awareness or sequence unfolds around you? That feels like something worth rethinking, or at least pausing on for a moment. One of the typologies involves ground-level observation, partly below the surface, according to the brief. So let's say we actually bury that one. Imagine something like a pipe or a tube, a stretcher lightly embedded into the earth. I sketched it very diagrammatically, but the idea is that these three elements work as a kind of set, a trio that forms a rhythm across the site. One of them becomes the tower, almost functioning like a signpost. You're walking through the landscape, and far away you spot this vertical element. Even if you don't know the exact route, you intuitively feel that you should head toward it. There are no strong markers besides that presence in the distance. You reach it, climb up, and maybe only from that height do certain things finally reveal themselves. From up there, you spot the buried observation point. You turn, and you see the other freestanding observation spot. Then you choose which direction to go next, almost like navigating a small system. And burying one of the structures isn't just technically logical. It also naturally provides elation, which you'll definitely need in a cold climate. It vents through a small chimney or opening. Conceptually, it ties back to the idea of privacy. It becomes a more intimate, enclosed moment, a space that's structurally hidden in the landscape, but still connected to the sequence of movement. And for example, if it only needs to hold 5 people, the plan can be extremely simple. Just a narrow corridor buried underground, with 1 or 2 small rooms branching off to the sides, like tiny pockets where people can step in and observe. Then I started wondering about something else. In the observation hut typology, I had placed a table to create a sense of community. But what if that element, the table, could actually be swapped with the tower? The tower idea grew from that. You build it slightly elevated, and you imagine placing a table at the top. It suddenly felt like the table might work better in the tower. You climb up, reach a raised platform, and there's a table surrounded by glass, almost like sitting in the sky. And when you can't really see where the glass begins or ends, it creates this seamless, floating feeling above the landscape. Maybe we make the table round too. At this point, it's even starting to feel a bit like a lighthouse. Something you climb from the very bottom all the way up, moving through a vertical journey before reaching the top space. I briefly thought about placing an elevator there, but honestly, I don't think it fits. Unless you did something experimental, like Ome's Bordeaux's house, where the entire floor acts as the elevator. The table rises with you, then gently goes back down after someone gets off. It's a fun thought, but probably too complicated for a single small structure. Still, the idea of sitting at a table in the sky feels right to me, almost poetic. Maybe the floor itself is reflective, so the whole space feels lighter, almost floating. From the outside, it reads clearly as a tower, a tall vertical one like a lighthouse. There's already a lighthouse in that village, so the association doesn't feel far-fetched at all. So you climb up, and from the outside you only see this reflective glass cylinder. Inside, the surfaces reflect as well, the floor, the ceiling, creating this sense of height and openness. There's the table in the center, and people sit around it, turning their heads, pointing things out. Look over here, look over there. It becomes a shared lookout point. And maybe the hut-type structure could work differently. Maybe it becomes more of an amphitheater, a step place to sit and watch. Sinheda has a project like that, an observation platform with an amphitheater. And if there's ever a guide on site, it could even become a spot where someone talks. So I was thinking, would this stepped idea actually help us in any meaningful way? But I don't want the idea to drift too far from the core concept. So let me go back to that for a second. I keep catching myself getting pulled toward the physical form, the materials, the shape, instead of the underlying idea. What if the whole thing were built out of earth? And then the tower version, maybe that one becomes a solid mass too. Compacted earth or stone, something heavy and grounded. Inside, there could be a simple stair system, people climbing up until they reach the top platform. If it's stone, honestly, it might actually work structurally. 7 meters isn't that tall. Or the tower could work differently altogether. Imagine the lookout point being right at the tip, and the entrance hidden underneath. You walk in from below, move upward through the structure, and eventually emerge somewhere in the middle, suddenly surrounded by open views on all sides. It could also use a spiral stair, something that wraps around as you move higher, giving small glimpses out before you reach the main view. And visually, this version ends up looking a lot like a water tower too. That same clean vertical silhouette rising from the landscape. Or what if we drop this whole idea altogether and instead fully lean into the house concept? The tower and the other structures, what if each one represents a different room of a house? All separated out across the site. As you walk from one space to the next, you're basically moving through the rooms of a house. Only pulled apart and rearranged by the landscape, it becomes one connected ensemble, just fragmented. The transition spaces sit inside the terrain, embedded in it. Maybe beneath this one, there's a tiny kitchen tucked away. And somewhere else, another room becomes the element that triggers the movement between them. And that movement takes you briefly outside into nature. The corridor could still be enclosed just enough to guide you. Some portions might open up. You can't linger there because it's only meant for passing through. But you can still peek outside and catch a glimpse of what's happening. And while walking through these in-between zones, you notice different things each time: shadows, wind, small details of the terrain. So it becomes like a house stretched out across the landscape. You move through enclosed connectors, then step out into the site and back inside again. But even with all that, I don't think I really like this idea that much. On the other hand, when I think back to the earlier ideas, especially the one that's partly buried underground, the idea of a mound still feels really strong to me. There's something satisfying about building into the earth, and then placing a small structure on top of it. The plan stays incredibly simple, but the experience becomes very specific. I think I'll definitely make one like this. Material-wise, maybe it works like this. You approach a single door tucked into the mound. The walls around it could be stone or densely packed earth, something that feels naturally rooted in the site. The door itself might be a dark metal, a kind of black, matte surface that blends quietly with the landscape. There's earth sitting on top of the structure too, so the whole thing feels like an extension of the terrain. And once you step inside, the corridor carries the same language. Narrow, enclosed, almost cave-like. But then as you enter deeper, the interior shifts. Suddenly everything is soft, not in the sense of furniture or chairs. More like the entire floor becomes a place to sit. You take your shoes off at the entrance, and the space invites you to settle down, almost like entering a warm, sheltered den. It could have heating too, though I'm still unsure about the exact method. But if people are meant to sit on the floor, there has to be a reason the surface is soft and warm. If the material doesn't allow you to touch or feel it, then the softness loses its meaning. I wonder, can we push this a bit further through materials? For example, earlier we were thinking of it like a cave, something that feels close, intimate. And the tower, completely through reflection, because it will have a reflective surface. Among all the structures, the tower would stand out the most. Making it fully reflective might not always be the best idea. For example, the way you relate to the landscape. Here, you experience it through the building as a sort of mediator. Your proximity to the glass actually defines your relationship with the terrain. Like, if you do it through the table, you're interacting with the landscape from a mid-range distance. You're here, the glass is there, and you're a bit farther away. But maybe think of it as a version of that very first idea. So, I was thinking the structure could have a bunch of holes, lots of different windows of varying sizes and proportions. Make the walls thick enough so you could even sit comfortably on the edges for a while. You could sit by the glass and watch. Maybe it would feel more immersive that way, a bit like you're part of the landscape itself. Actually, let's push it a bit further. It doesn't have to be a flat structure. Stacked boxes, one on top of the other, creating a slightly chaotic, layered composition that changes as you move around it. I'm not entirely sure yet how it'd work, but the height would max out at around 7 meters. So maybe 2 or 3 different levels, each offering a unique perspective and experience. Basically, you'd have a bunch of screens, spots from which you can observe nature in different ways. On the lower level, other people might be there, and you could use the windows as seating areas. Sit by the glass, get closer to the view, and in the middle of the landscape, these complex, interlocking structures start to emerge, almost like a small, layered village. I don't know exactly yet. Of course, there would need to be a staircase somewhere. Maybe a simple roof on top, just enough to protect against the elements and the weather. And maybe a small opening somewhere so you could climb up through the middle if needed, adding another layer of exploration. So imagine this: you arrive at the staircase entrance. One person at a time is fine. The stairs rise like this, and there's a corridor wrapping around them. These box-like forms, attached boxes, you can step inside, sit down, take it all in, and discover little moments along the way. I like this idea because it changes how the observer interacts with the structure. It offers more variety, more ways to experience it, more moments of discovery and surprise. So, not bad at all. And thinking about it, the tallest, most eye-catching element also becomes visually interesting just through its form and composition. This enriches the interior experience, and also the experience from the outside. From that perspective, having the cabin typology in the form of a house makes sense. It's more ordinary, familiar, approachable. But maybe this concept could be taken one step further, pushing both form and experience in a more playful, layered direction, creating a place that surprises you at every level. So, for the cabin, here's an idea I've been mulling over. In the tower, what did we do? We framed certain views for people so they could experience nature, watch birds, or just take in the surroundings in a focused way. The framing gave a sense of direction and purpose to what you saw. Now, when we bury the structure underground, the experience changes. It becomes more personal, more intense, almost intimate. There's still a kind of frame, but being closer to the ground changes the perception completely. It diverges from the tower experience, giving it its own character. You feel more enclosed, more connected to the earth itself. For the cabin concept, I started thinking maybe it could be 360 degrees, fully open to the landscape, surrounded entirely by glass, reflective glass, so that from the outside it blends in, almost disappears, but from the inside you're completely immersed in the view. In the middle, there could be a seating area, something simple but central, where you can rest and observe. The structure should be closable too. Basically, it's simple, normally closed, and then opens with a wooden cover or some similar mechanism. Olsen Kundig has plenty of references for mechanisms like this, which is inspiring. So it's a form sitting in the middle of nature, embedded in the landscape. About the interior, the idea I've been thinking about isn't exactly like an amphitheater, but more intricate, with different elevations and ledges and stepped wooden surfaces. It's playful, but also intimate. It's a cabin that invites both observation and pause, a little retreat that sits quietly in the landscape, but still feels connected to everything around it. Su Fujimoto had concepts like this, and I find them really inspiring. It's important for the structure to be as transparent as possible, almost like it's barely there. Maybe glass or very thin metal, something that can almost disappear into the landscape. The idea is not to draw too much attention, to let the surroundings speak. Of course, that could also be a bit tiring, because you might want to lean back, relax, or just take a break without feeling exposed. I also started thinking about making it fully 360 degrees visible. It could be really interesting, letting you see everything around you, but is it really necessary? I'm not entirely sure. Maybe just part of it is enough, or maybe the full rotation adds a subtle intensity. Basically, combining these two ideas feels logical to me. You can sit at different levels, in different ways, and experience it uniquely. As long as nothing blocks your view or interferes with the experience, I don't see a problem. I want to take these 3 or so ideas, put them together, and actually visualize them. Model them, see how they function, and understand the spatial relationships. It's one thing to think about it, another to actually see it in form. Don't forget to like and follow. See you in the next video.